Senator Rose Conway-Walsh.
I want to discuss mandatory disclosure, and in particularly the decision by government in November to put in that amendment on the advice of the HSE, the amendment that would mean that it was voluntary rather than mandatory. And Minister, I just want to ask you, who gave you that advice within the HSE? Who gave you that advice?
I don't believe that advice was given by the HSE. In fairness, it's advice given by the Chief Medical Officer, which, and by the way, it was also advice given at this committee by the Chief Medical Officer and accepted by this committee in a report that's produced and that the Taoiseach has referenced on the floor of the Dáil. So, just to be very clear, Senator, that this was an issue that was scrutinised at detail and in a very constructive way by this committee, very constructive way. It produced a very fine report, which found in line with the Chief Medical Officer's view. So,
but you obviously didn't have, we know you give the impression in terms of being the committee that you had cross-party support for it being voluntary rather than mandatory. While it might have been discussed at the committee, the recommendations from the HSE were that it would be voluntary.
I don't mean to correct you, but just in the interest of fairness to everyone, it wasn't that it's the Department of Health, the Chief Medical Officer, rather than the HSE. Sorry.
So the HSE didn't give any opinion at all on it. So the Chief Medical Officer is
Dr. Tony Houlihan.
Not connected to the HSE?
No, he's in my department.
Right. You see, this is part of the problem. It's not him, but it's me, State Claims Agency.
No, only if you make it the problem.
It's bonded up. But it is. Well, it's a problem in terms of transparency, and it's a problem in terms of. I mean, would you admit now that it was a serious error of judgment last November to follow that advice?
No, I wouldn't. But just allow me, I welcome the back and forth, but just allow me to answer the question. Chief Medical Officer is the medical advisor to the Minister for Health. I don't think there's any confusion or lack of transparency in relation to that. His name's Dr. Tony Houlihan. He's very well known to members of these houses. Dr. Houlihan gave a view to me, to my predecessor and to this committee in terms of how would you best implement open disclosure. And the view was, I'm not speaking for it, but my interpretation of that advice was this, that in relation to open disclosure, it should be in place right across the health service, that it's already policy of the HSE since 2013, clearly hasn't been implemented. I fully accept that, Senator. That we should underpin it in a voluntary nature in the Civil Liability Amendment Act, but that we should make it mandatory for serious events in the health service by legislation. And this is not something that's just come about now. I'm using now as a momentum to get the legislation passed, but I would have corresponded in writing with Deputy Claire Daly in November of last year in relation to giving her an assurance, because she did great work on this, in relation to giving her an assurance that we were going to legislate for mandatory. So the advice, my understanding of the advice was bring in open disclosure for everything in the health service, but it's mandatory for serious incidents as well.
But who defines whether something is a serious incident or not? Because while we even talked yesterday to the State Claims Agency, it was obvious that, you know, Vicky Phelan was just another run-of-the-mill. There was no need to report it to anybody. There was no need to do anything else. So who defines what's serious and at what point?
Yeah, there will be a list of definitions in the Act, and I think that's a really important job for this House to do. I've already said very clearly that screening, as a result of Ms Phelan's case, that screening will be clearly identified in the definition of serious, but that will be a list of definitions.
Why did you find it necessary to still put in the amendment? I can't understand.
Because
if you welcome mandatory reporting and all of that, and it's not only mandatory reporting of, I suppose, serious incidents, but it's mandatory reporting, to have that culture of mandatory reporting within the system.
Yeah, I followed the advice. So for starters, the legislation it's justice legislation, the Civil Liability Amendment Act. The government's intention in relation to the legislation was, just as I outlined, to have open disclosure for everything and voluntary for some and mandatory for serious. That Deputy Daly had produced an amendment in relation to that issue that was out of kilter with that. Yeah. The committee considered it here. The Health Committee produced a report. It's there for all to see. And the government and the Oireachtas, which voted on it, took the decision that it was best to have mandatory in a separate piece of legislation. And yesterday I got permission to draft a patient safety bill which will make it mandatory, which will bring in mandatory open.
Yeah, and I very much welcome that, but I do think that even in that grounds, I think it speaks to something of, you know, who is in control here. I want to ask you, and I'm going to move on from that because I have limited time, I want to ask you on the redress scheme.
Yeah.
Can you explain to me why a redress scheme cannot be set up in parallel with an inquiry? Because I'm concerned that if a redress scheme doesn't come until after the inquiry, then how are people going to access that? Or maybe you have new information on that or information I don't have.
The Taoiseach gave a commitment in the Dáil last week that there will be redress by the government. The government has had some initial conversations in relation to this, but has yet to make a decision in relation to what that scheme might look like. The Taoiseach outlined in the Dáil yesterday that he thought it was sensible to establish all of the facts first. I've also heard some of the women impacted say that as well. The scoping inquiry that has been established, and in fairness, and I credit your own party spokesperson, Deputy O'Reilly, and others as well for the engagement on this, the structure that's been set up will produce answers and a report very quickly. So Dr. Scally will report in what's about 3 weeks' time, the first week of June, and then his final report by the end of June. So I do think we need to get this right. We need to exactly identify the number of women that were impacted, what the redress is for, where the liability may be for the state, whether that's a legal or moral liability, and where the liability might be for a lab. And we've obviously seen the two of them interact already in the Vicky Phelan case.
Can you just maybe speak to the point that was raised by my own colleague Pierce Doherty yesterday with the State Claims Agency around the State Claims Agency taking control of the situation, whereby you haven't got a situation then where you have the women versus the labs, the two labs in America, that they intervene. Would you support such a move by the State Claims Agency?
To caveat it by saying I'm not a lawyer and I'm certainly not the Attorney General, but the idea that the state should not be in conflict with women who it wishes to help absolutely makes sense. The best mechanism to do that, if the liability rests with the laboratory, and I know we might be privileged here, but I don't want to say anything that poses any difficulty for any woman in their own legal interactions. The idea that there may be a liability with a lab for some cases, and the idea that we would help support women in those cases rather than be in an adversarial situation is something the government wants to do. So the Taoiseach has asked the Attorney General to work with the State Claims Agency and report back to government. So I instinctivly think the suggestion you put forward is a sensible one. Legally, whether it's workable or not is something we need to do.
Yeah, because I do think it's important to know. This is my final two words. I think it's very important because many of profit-driven organisations will not be driven by fairness and the ethical stance that would be hopefully from a state agency. Thank you, Claire.
Thank you very much.